Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Today we will explore how the Malfoy family throughout the entire Harry Potter saga not only demonstrated their loyalty to Voldemort, but also showed moments when they didn't act so terribly. Want to see how we can view the Malfoys in a kinder light? Enjoy watching. Number 1. Narcissa protected Harry. Many mistakenly believe Narcissa Malfoy was a Death Eater, but in reality, she was never part of Voldemort's inner circle. Yes, she supported him, but everything she did was for the sake of her family, especially her son. When Voldemort demanded she reveal Harry's whereabouts, Narcissa refused. She hid the truth about the boy, and it was thanks to her that he remained alive. Even if it had cost her life, she would have still chosen her family. Number 2. Draco. Didn't recognize Harry. Draco Malfoy is not a perfect hero, but he's not someone who can be called a true villain either. When he had to face Harry, he did not betray him to the Death Eaters, even though he should have easily recognized him by the scar on Harry's forehead and his companions Ron and Hermione. But Draco refused to do this, risking his own family and well-being. This act undoubtedly deserves respect. Number 3. Draco saved Goyle. Draco Malfoy and his friends, Crabbe and Goyle, were often seen as mere support for Draco, but in one critical situation, Draco showed a different side of himself. When Goyle lost consciousness, Draco, despite the danger to his own life, held him in his arms. He could have left him, but instead, he chose to save his friend. Number 4. Lucius and Narcissa didn't participate in the Battle of Hogwarts. The Malfoys were loyal supporters of Voldemort, but at the last moment, they decided to refuse to follow his plan and didn't participate in the Battle of Hogwarts. Many saw this as cowardice, but in reality, it was an expression of their desire to protect their family. They didn't want their actions to result in more casualties, and this should also be considered when evaluating their actions. Number 5. Draco accepted the Death Eater's cloak to save his family. When Voldemort began to manipulate the Malfoy family, Draco found himself in a difficult situation. He didn't want to become a Death Eater, but he was forced to accept this decision for the sake of his family. This act shows how important his family was to him and the sacrifices he was willing to make to save them. Number 6. Draco didn't kill Dumbledore. When Voldemort demanded Draco kill Dumbledore, he faced a huge moral dilemma. Although Draco tried to carry out the task, he couldn't bring himself to kill Dumbledore. This was a moment when, despite the pressure, Draco made a conscious choice and ultimately did not become a murderer, saving his own soul in the process. Number 7. Draco stopped Crabbe from attacking Harry and Hermione. In another moment, when Crabbe wanted to use the unforgivable curses on Harry and Hermione, Draco intervened. He asked Crabbe to spare them because Voldemort wanted them to stay alive. In this moment, we see that Draco still had humanity within him, and he couldn't just destroy people without reason. Number 8. Draco chose his own path in marriage. In The Cursed Child, Draco Malfoy showed that he had changed. He married Astoria Greengrass despite his parents' objections to the union. This act speaks to the fact that he had become a more independent and mature person, someone who wasn't afraid to go against the wishes of the older generation for his own happiness. The Malfoy family are complex characters, and although their connection to the Dark Lord undoubtedly casts a shadow on their reputation, their actions at certain moments show that they had their own moral compass and a desire to protect their loved ones. Number 9. Lucius tried to protect Draco from Voldemort's wrath. Lucius Malfoy was often seen as cold and calculating, a man who would do anything to further his own ambitions. But after the failed mission in the Department of Mysteries, his actions toward his son, Draco, revealed a more vulnerable side. When Voldemort assigned Draco the impossible task of killing Dumbledore, Lucius, even from his prison cell in Azkaban, tried desperately to change the course of events. He knew that Voldemort had sentenced Draco to death, and in his own way, Lucius couldn't bear to see his son face such a fate. In his attempts to protect Draco, Lucius sent secret letters through his allies, desperately trying to warn and influence those around him. He was a man caught between his loyalty to the Dark Lord and the love for his family. Lucius knew he could not openly defy Voldemort, but he used every ounce of his cunning to try and prevent Draco from being killed. His actions showed that despite his hardened exterior, Lucius was capable of deep care for his family. His desperation to save Draco from Voldemort's wrath was a testament to the depth of his fatherly love. Number 10. Narcissa helped Snape keep Draco alive. When Draco Malfoy was given the deadly task of killing Dumbledore, his mother, Narcissa, knew her son was in grave danger. Despite the dangerous mission and the overwhelming pressure from Voldemort, Narcissa's primary concern was protecting Draco. She knew that he was not prepared to kill and feared for his life. Desperate, she turned to Severus Snape, whom she trusted. "You must protect Draco," she said, urging him to make a vow to safeguard her son at all costs. This request led to the unbreakable vow, a magical bond that bound Snape to protect Draco with his life. By insisting on the vow, Narcissa didn't just ask for protection. She was willing to risk everything, even the life of someone she had relied on for help. The unbreakable vow was a powerful act of love, but it was also a dangerous commitment, one that could lead to Snape's death. Narcissa's willingness to involve Snape in such a dangerous promise shows just how far she was willing to go to save Draco. She understood that this was a matter of life and death, not just for Draco, but for everyone involved. The stakes were incredibly high, and Narcissa was willing to gamble everything for her son's safety. This act demonstrated that despite being a loyal supporter of Voldemort, Narcissa's greatest loyalty was to her family. She was willing to defy the Dark Lord's expectations and make sacrifices that were far outside the role of a typical Death Eater. Her actions proved that she was a mother first, prepared to go to any lengths to protect her child. Even in the face of Voldemort's wrath, Narcissa's love for Draco transcended all boundaries, and it was this love that led to the powerful, if secret, alliance between her and Snape. Number 11. Draco returned Harry's wand after the Battle of Hogwarts. After the Battle of Hogwarts, the wizarding world was filled with anger and the desire for vengeance. Many wanted to take justice into their own hands, particularly against former Death Eaters. Yet in the midst of this chaos, Harry Potter chose a different path. Instead of seeking revenge, he showed mercy to the Malfoy family. In return, Draco Malfoy, who had been part of Voldemort's ranks, made a small but significant gesture. He returned Harry's wand, which had been lost in the battle. This simple act wasn't just about returning a piece of property. It symbolized something much deeper. Draco was acknowledging that the world had changed. The old rivalries, the hatred between their families, could no longer define them. By handing over the wand, Draco was signaling that he was ready to move on, to leave the past behind. "I think you'll find this belongs to you," Draco said, his voice softer than usual. It wasn't just about the wand. It was about showing respect for the changes that had come with the war's end. Draco's gesture was a quiet but powerful sign that he was willing to break free from his family's past. He didn't have to do it, yet he did, showing that he understood Harry's role in defeating Voldemort. This act was Draco's way of accepting that things had changed. It wasn't just about the physical wand, It was about Draco acknowledging that his past mistakes didn't define him and that he could make a different choice moving forward. Number 12. Lucius and Narcissa raised Scorpius with different values. After Voldemort's defeat, Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy made a quiet but significant change in their lives. The values that had shaped their family for generations, blood purity, power, and disdain for Muggleborns, were no longer central to their way of thinking. They understood that the world had shifted, and so did their perspective. When their grandson, Scorpius, came into their lives, they decided not to repeat the mistakes of the past. They raised him with a different set of values, ones based on tolerance and respect for all magical beings. Instead of fostering the old prejudices, Lucius and Narcissa encouraged Scorpius to embrace the diversity of the wizarding world. They didn't stop him from befriending students from different backgrounds, including those from less prestigious magical families. Scorpius, unlike his ancestors, didn't grow up with a sense of superiority. He was taught that everyone deserved respect, regardless of their blood status. Narcissa, in particular, made sure that her grandson knew kindness and acceptance were virtues to be valued above all. Lucius, though stern and proud, also showed a different side. He allowed his grandson to form friendships freely, even with Harry Potter's children. When Scorpius struggled with his reputation as the son of Draco Malfoy, it was Lucius who reminded him that his name didn't define him. "You are more than your family's past," he told Scorpius. Lucius, who had once been a man defined by his loyalty to Voldemort, now encouraged Scorpius to define his own future, free from the burdens of their history. Scorpius grew up to be a kind and open-minded young man, entirely different from the Malfoys who came before him. His ability to form true friendships regardless of blood status was a direct result of Lucius and Narcissa's decision to change. They chose to give him a life unburdened by their past mistakes. In doing so, they broke the cycle of hate that had long been a part of their family, ensuring that Scorpius would be part of a new legacy, one based on love, respect, and acceptance. Number 13. Draco admitted his family's mistakes and reconciled with Harry and Ron. Years after the war, in The Cursed Child, Draco Malfoy did something no one would have expected from his younger self. He took the first step toward reconciling with Harry Potter and Ron Weasley. For years, Draco had been raised in a family that valued blood purity and upheld the belief that those who didn't share their views were enemies. But as an adult, Draco began to realize that hatred only perpetuated more hatred, and he was determined to change that. In a quiet moment, Draco approached Harry and Ron. It wasn't a grand gesture, no dramatic apologies, but there was something sincere in his actions. He didn't need to say much. His willingness to put aside the bitter history between them was enough. Draco had spent so many years trying to live up to his family's expectations, but now he was ready to break away from them. He had come to understand that peace was worth more than pride. Draco's gesture wasn't without its risks. He knew the Malfoy name was still tied to Voldemort's regime, and the past couldn't be erased in an instant. But he chose to make the effort, even if it was small and cautious. He didn't expect forgiveness right away, but he was willing to try. "I've made my share of mistakes," he confessed to Harry, his voice quieter than usual, as if the words were finally being said after years of being locked inside. This was Draco's way of saying that people can change. He had been a part of a family that had supported Voldemort, and he had once despised the very idea of friendship with Muggleborns. But in this small act, Draco showed that the past didn't have to define him. By reaching out to Harry and Ron, he proved that redemption was possible and that one could choose to leave behind old grudges in order to build something new. Number 14. Narcissa secretly supported Andromeda after the war. After the Battle of Hogwarts, Narcissa Malfoy made a secret, unexpected choice. Despite her estranged relationship with her sister, Andromeda Tonks, due to Andromeda's marriage to the Muggle-born Ted Tonks, Narcissa reached out to her. After losing both her husband and daughter in the war, Andromeda was devastated. In her time of need, Narcissa sent letters and, more surprisingly, provided financial help. This act of kindness was hidden, known only to a few, but it was Narcissa who helped Andromeda survive the darkest period of her life. The Malfoys had always adhered to strict beliefs about blood purity. They had long rejected anyone they saw as a traitor, especially those like Andromeda, who had married a Muggle-born. For Narcissa to defy her family's views and reach out to Andromeda was a bold move, one that could have been seen as betrayal. Yet she chose to do it anyway, driven by something deeper. Her sisterly love outweighed the harsh principles that had governed her family for so long. Narcissa's actions were never fully acknowledged, but they spoke volumes about her character. She could have easily turned her back on Andromeda, just as the rest of the Malfoy family had done. But in the silence of those difficult times, Narcissa became the one who offered solace. She didn't need to reveal herself as the benefactor, but her quiet support showed that, even in the darkest of times, family bonds could surpass the most rigid beliefs. Narcissa's secret kindness was a reminder that love could break through the walls of hatred and prejudice. Her actions were not about seeking recognition or praise. They were about helping her sister when no one else would. And though her loyalty to her family never wavered, it was clear that in the end, Narcissa's heart had a place for the family she had almost lost, and she wasn't willing to let it go. Number 15. Lucius tried to stop Bellatrix at Malfoy Manor. Lucius Malfoy, a loyal follower of Voldemort, never showed any sign of compassion. He had long been known for his cold demeanor and unwavering support of the Dark Lord. Yet in a small moment of weakness we saw something different. When Bellatrix Lestrange was torturing Hermione Granger in the Malfoy Manor, Lucius tried to stop her. It wasn't an open act of defiance, but the subtle signs were there. He didn't raise his voice or challenge Bellatrix directly, but his worried glances and hesitant words spoke volumes. At one point, as Bellatrix's cruel laughter echoed through the walls, Lucius approached her, his voice strained. "Isn't that enough, Bellatrix?" he asked, his tone almost pleading. He didn't dare to go further, to openly oppose her in front of the other Death Eaters, but it was clear he was uncomfortable. This small act of restraint revealed a side of him that wasn't entirely aligned with the cruelty of the Dark Lord's followers. It was as if even Lucius had a limit to the evil he could bear. Despite his past, which was filled with loyalty to Voldemort and acts of malice, this moment hinted at something deeper within Lucius. In his eyes there was a flicker of regret, perhaps even a shadow of remorse. He didn't actively stop Bellatrix, but the way he tried to minimize the suffering hinted at a hidden conscience. For a brief moment he was not the ruthless aristocrat who served the Dark Lord without question. Instead he seemed like a man trapped by his choices, unwilling to acknowledge the depth of his own involvement. This subtle act didn't absolve Lucius of his past sins. His cruelty and support of Voldemort couldn't be erased with a glance of hesitation, but it did show that even someone like him, hardened by years of loyalty to the Dark Lord, could be disturbed by the sheer brutality he had helped to create. It was a brief, quiet moment, but it suggested that Lucius, for all his faults, still had a sliver of humanity left inside him. Number 16. Draco regretted Crabbe's death despite his betrayal. The Battle of Hogwarts, which unfolded in the final book of the Harry Potter series, was a scene of chaos, loss, and emotional turmoil. Among the myriad of characters caught in the conflict, Draco Malfoy's journey stood out not only because of his family's affiliation with the Dark Lord, but also because of the unexpected layers of morality that emerged in his character. Draco, raised in a world that glorified pure-blood supremacy, was expected to follow in his father's footsteps and join Voldemort's ranks as a loyal Death Eater. But as the war progressed, Draco found himself caught between two worlds, his family's expectations and his growing realization of the darkness around him. During the Battle of Hogwarts, one of the most significant events was the death of Vincent Crabbe, Draco's former schoolmate and a fellow member of the infamous Slytherin trio that included Gregory Goyle. Crabbe's role in the battle was not one of bravery or honor, but of rashness and desperation. In an attempt to use the dangerous fiend fire in the Room of Requirement, Crabbe inadvertently set off a chain of events that led to his tragic end. He had hoped to capture Harry Potter, but instead he caused a fire that consumed the room and, tragically, his own life. While Crabbe's death could be seen as a result of his reckless nature and the decisions he made, Draco's reaction to his former friend's death revealed a more complex aspect of his character than many would have expected. Draco's feelings toward Crabbe's death were not those of indifference or satisfaction, which one might have expected from someone so deeply enmeshed in the Malfoy family's ethos of pure-blood pride. Instead, Draco was consumed with guilt. He regretted Crabbe's death despite the fact that Crabbe had betrayed him and had fought against his own former leader, Harry Potter. The tragedy was that Draco felt responsible for Crabbe's downfall. He believed that Crabbe, like many others, had been led astray by the influence of others. As much as he was surrounded by the pressure to conform to his family's ideals, Draco could not ignore the human side of him that mourned the loss of someone he had once considered a companion. What made Draco's regret stand out even more was his acknowledgement of his own role in Crabbe's actions. Draco had been a part of the toxic environment that pushed Crabbe into the depths of loyalty to Voldemort, even though it was clear that Crabbe, in many ways, had never been as invested in the Dark Lord's cause as Draco's father, Lucius Malfoy. Draco himself was caught in the same trap. He had joined the Death Eaters under duress, and yet, unlike Crabbe, he had not lost his sense of morality completely. Even though Crabbe had sided against him in the final battle, Draco still held on to the belief that the boy's misguided actions were a result of the people around him, especially Draco himself. This was not merely a moment of self-pity or guilt, but a recognition of the damage caused by the toxic atmosphere that surrounded the young Malfoy and his followers. In Draco's eyes, Crabbe was not just another Death Eater, but a victim of his own circumstances. He was someone who had been easily influenced by the expectations of his family and the dangerous world they inhabited. Draco, now more aware of the consequences of his own choices, felt a deep sense of responsibility for what had happened to Crabbe. In the moments following Crabbe's death, Draco reflected on how his own actions had played a role in leading his former friend down a path that ended tragically. It was not just about what had happened in the Room of Requirement, it was about the cumulative effect of years of influence, pressure, and the environment of hatred that had shaped Crabbe's decisions. This sense of personal responsibility, this deep and profound regret, distinguished Draco from many others in Voldemort's inner circle. The Death Eaters, particularly those like Bellatrix Lestrange and Lucius Malfoy, were notorious for their complete lack of empathy for those outside their circle of influence. For them, loyalty to Voldemort was paramount, and there was no room for any emotional attachments that could complicate their devotion to the Dark Lord. In contrast, Draco was not so consumed by loyalty to Voldemort that he could disregard the loss of a friend. He had seen through the lies and manipulation, and in the aftermath of the battle, he was left to reckon with the reality of his own involvement in the suffering of others. The fact that Draco Malfoy experienced guilt and sorrow over Crabbe's death spoke to a significant shift in his character. Throughout the series, Draco was portrayed as someone who was often torn between what was expected of him and what he felt was right. In the early books, he was a bully who took pleasure in mocking Harry and others. He was arrogant and condescending, following the path laid out by his father and the Dark Lord. However, as the story unfolded, it became clear that Draco's journey was one of internal conflict. His loyalty to Voldemort was never as solid as it seemed, and as the pressure mounted, he began to realize that the world he had been born into was one of cruelty and manipulation. Number 17. The Malfoy family gave up dark artifacts after the war. The decision of the Malfoy family to surrender their dark artifacts after the Second Wizarding War stands as one of the most unexpected but defining moments of the post-Voldemort era. For generations, the Malfoys carried a reputation carved from wealth, refinement, and an unwavering belief in the superiority of pure-blood heritage. Their elegant manor in Wiltshire had long concealed cabinets of sinister relics, items steeped in curses, blood magic, and forbidden enchantments. When the war ended, these relics could have remained hidden behind layers of glamours and magical protections. Instead, Lucius Malfoy personally oversaw their return to the Ministry, transforming what once symbolized power into an act that symbolized surrender and perhaps redemption. When historians recount this moment, they often focus on the symbolism rather than the objects themselves. But the objects mattered. Among the confiscated items was a silver-framed mirror infused with an enchantment that allowed the viewer not only to observe distant events, but to manipulate shadows within the reflections, magic directly linked to early Death Eater rituals. Another was a family grimoire handwritten by Abraxas Malfoy, containing instructions for binding one's will to an enchanted object. There were cursed masks from the time when the Malfoy line flirted with necromantic circles, as well as a set of dark, runic stones believed to have been used in the early experiments that predated Horcrux research. Each item contained the weight of history, intent, and old loyalties. Handing them over was not merely a legal gesture. It meant dismantling the legacy that had defined the Malfoy identity for centuries. The Ministry officials who received the artifacts were stunned by the sheer scope of the collection. Kingsley Shacklebolt, then rising to become Minister for Magic, personally ensured the integrity of the process. He understood the political and symbolic magnitude of this surrender. For the Malfoys, performing this act publicly risked alienating their old allies among the remaining pure-blood supremacist families. Yet for Lucius, Narcissa, and Draco, the war had already transformed their view of loyalty and idealism. Their decision came not from pressure, but from witnessing firsthand the devastation caused when allegiance to a Dark Lord eclipses all morality. The echoes of these realizations linger in Draco's later reflection from Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, where he is described as pale and petrified, unable to commit fully to the madness erupting around him. Another layer to this story lies in the emotional landscape inside Malfoy Manor during the final months of the war. The manor had become a prison as much as a home, its ornate halls echoing with fear rather than pride. Narcissa, known for her elegance and poise, had watched her son being pulled deeper into Voldemort's machinations. She had already made a defining moral choice when she lied to Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest with the words, "Harry Potter is dead," an act rooted not in ideology but in maternal love. That moment broke the ideological chain linking the Malfoys to Voldemort. When a mother risks everything to save her child rather than to serve her master, the old political commitments crumble. Years later, scholars would note that Narcissa's choice in the forest was the true beginning of the Malfoys' transformation. Draco's presence during the artifact surrender is perhaps the most compelling aspect of the event. He had grown up being taught that dark arts were tools, not sins. Yet the war forced him to confront their consequences in the harshest possible way. Students at Hogwarts remember the frightened look on his face as he attempted to mend the vanishing cabinet, and Harry himself observed Draco crying in the bathroom, unable to carry out Voldemort's orders. These memories shaped Draco's worldview significantly. When he placed a cursed opal necklace into the Ministry's hands, a necklace his mother had warned him never to touch, he effectively severed the idea that darkness belonged to the Malfoys by birthright. Witnesses reported that he hesitated before releasing the artifact, as if letting go of something fragile and poisonous at the same time. Equally notable was Lucius Malfoy's posture during the surrender. Once a man who commanded rooms with cold authority, he stood with a demeanor described by observers as exhausted dignity. Throughout the war, his attempts to regain Voldemort's favor had backfired, leaving him stripped of both status and confidence. He had tasted the very fear that he once instilled in others. The surrender allowed him at last to step out of a role built upon intimidation. In a sense, Lucius relinquished more than cursed objects. He relinquished a lifetime of alignment with the power structures that had defined him. This internal shift echoes Dumbledore's line, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." The sentiment applies powerfully to Lucius, a man choosing, finally, something different. The Malfoys' actions carried weight beyond personal redemption. The wizarding world was hungry for stability after 2 decades punctuated by terror. Families had lost sons and daughters, Hogwarts had been scarred, ministry departments had collapsed. Trust was in shambles. When a family with the influence and notoriety of the Malfoys demonstrated a willingness to abandon dark traditions, others reconsidered their own allegiances. Some families followed their example, surrendering hidden caches of contraband. Others refused and faced the legal consequences. The Malfoys, perhaps unintentionally, became the fulcrum for a cultural shift toward transparency and magical inheritance. Even more powerful was the social evolution that followed. Draco Malfoy returned to Hogwarts for his 8th year under a cloud of suspicion, but he encountered something unexpected: space for change. Former classmates reported that Draco became quieter, more introspective, more observant. While he did not seek friendship with Harry, Hermione, or Ron, he refrained from antagonism and focused intensely on his studies. One student noted that Draco once stopped a younger Slytherin from casting a hex in the hallway, telling him sharply that this is not what Slytherin stands for anymore. Over time, Draco's shift influenced other students, softening the long-held stereotypes attached to the Slytherin name. Number 18, Draco openly supported Scorpius and Albus Potter's friendship. Draco Malfoy's transformation reached a profound depth in the years following the Second Wizarding War, but nowhere was this inner shift more visible than in the pages of Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, where he actively supported the unlikely friendship between his son, Scorpius Malfoy, and Albus Severus Potter. For decades, the Malfoy name carried the weight of prejudice, elitism, and pure-blood arrogance. Yet Draco's devotion to his son shattered these expectations. He did not hesitate when the moment came to defend Scorpius, not only from cruel rumors, but also from pressures within the surviving pureblood community. His actions revealed a man who had matured far beyond the narrow ideology he once inherited, choosing instead to build a new legacy of empathy and loyalty. The skepticism surrounding Scorpius began the very moment he entered Hogwarts, not because of anything he had done, but because whispers took on a life of their own. Some wizards insisted that the boy was not Draco's biological son at all, spreading the poisonous rumor that he was the offspring of Voldemort, born through dark magic. Draco confronted these accusations with a calm but unbreakable resolve. In the book, he describes how the lies cut through him like poisoned thorns, a powerful metaphor showing how deeply he felt the injustice aimed at his child. Yet instead of retreating into isolation or lashing out, Draco chose a path that his younger self would never have taken, standing publicly with Scorpius and declaring him a Malfoy not by rumor, but by truth and love. The friendship between Scorpius and Albus Potter was not simply a childhood bond, it was a union of two boys who both felt misunderstood, pressed by expectations they did not ask for. Albus, struggling under the immense weight of his father's legacy, found solace in Scorpius, who understood loneliness even more deeply. Draco saw this connection early, recognizing in Albus the same kind of gentle sincerity he saw in his own son. When several families questioned the appropriateness of such a friendship, particularly those who still clung to ideals of blood purity, Draco ignored the pressure. He placed his son's emotional well-being above the opinions of the traditionalist elite. In one particularly revealing moment, Draco reflects on the years after the Battle of Hogwarts, saying that he spent too long caring about the judgment of others. The narrative notes how he finally learned that true redemption was not found in grand gestures, but in everyday acts of courage, such as allowing Scorpius to choose his own friends. The text paints his quiet decision as more meaningful than any duel or victory could have been. By supporting the friendship with Albus, Draco achieved something his younger self never managed. He broke the chain of inherited prejudice. Draco's evolution becomes even clearer when the Ministry of Magic investigates the rumors of time travel and dark magic surrounding the boy's adventures. The situation placed Scorpius in a vulnerable position, and Draco did not retreat behind his family's former influence. Instead, the book describes him standing alongside Harry Potter, not as an adversary but as a father driven by the same fierce instinct to protect his child. Draco's internal monologue reflects a remarkable shift when he acknowledges that Harry Potter had always been the hero the world needed, but now he needed to be the father his son deserved. In supporting Harry during the investigation, Draco showed that he understood the importance of unity beyond old rivalries. The text emphasizes an instance where Scorpius came home in tears after other students mocked him for being the son of a villain. Here, Draco's reaction is written with raw vulnerability. He is described as gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white, realizing that the shadows of his past had become burdens for his son. The narrative highlights that Draco did not scold Scorpius for being sensitive, nor did he hide behind pride. Instead, he reassured his son with a quiet determination, insisting that the world's mistakes would not define him. This moment demonstrates how Draco refused to repeat the emotional coldness that characterized his own upbringing. His public defense of Scorpius during a gathering of pure-blood families became a defining turning point, and the description in the text is striking. Draco is portrayed rising slowly from his seat, his pale eyes steady and unafraid as he declared, "This family will not be ruled by fear." The narration emphasizes how the room fell silent, shocked that the former Slytherin heir would dare defy traditions that had existed for centuries. His voice is written as firm, unyielding, filled with the weight of a father's love, marking the moment when he stepped out from under Lucius Malfoy's shadow and into his own identity. Albus Potter's presence in Scorpius's life is portrayed as a source of unexpected strength. Draco recognized that their bond was not a rebellion, but a remedy. The text even mentions that Draco privately admired Albus's refusal to conform to others' expectations. In him, Draco saw qualities he once dismissed: empathy, vulnerability, and open-mindedness. Supporting their friendship was not simply a passive acceptance, it was an active choice to encourage his son to embrace the kind of values Draco himself had neglected in his youth. One of the most striking narrative passages appears when Draco recalls the day he first saw Scorpius and Albus laughing together on platform 9 3/4. The text remarks that for a brief moment Draco felt a warmth he had rarely known as a child, realizing that happiness was not a privilege of blood, but a privilege of the heart. The imagery here is gentle and symbolic, contrasting sharply with scenes from Draco's own childhood, filled with the cold elegance of Malfoy Manor and the weight of expectations. Number 19. Narcissa helped hide evidence that could hurt Snape. There are moments in wizarding history that never make it into official records, yet they shape the legacy of individuals far more than public proclamations. The story of Narcissa Malfoy and the final honor she protected for Severus Snape belongs to this hidden category. After the chaos of the Battle of Hogwarts subsided and the Ministry began piecing together the events of the war, Snape's name became a battlefield of its own. Many witches and wizards remembered only the man who had killed Albus Dumbledore atop the Astronomy Tower. Even with Harry Potter publicly declaring Snape's loyalty, suspicion lingered in the corners of wizarding society. Yet Narcissa Malfoy, once considered a symbol of pure-blood arrogance, silently took it upon herself to guard the truth when it could no longer defend itself. In the weeks following Voldemort's fall, the Malfoy Manor was transformed from a place of luxury into a vault of dangerous secrets. Ministry investigators arrived often, combing through every room to find evidence of past allegiances. Narcissa, however, had anticipated this. Hidden inside her late sister's black lacquered jewelry box, an artifact Bellatrix Lestrange had once used to store cursed letters, Narcissa had concealed a set of parchments written in Severus Snape's distinct angular handwriting. These parchments were not confessions, but rather fragments of coded correspondence between Snape and Dumbledore, created during the time they coordinated their strategy to protect Harry Potter. The Ministry, had it discovered them, could have easily misconstrued the cryptic language as proof of double-dealing. Instead of clarifying Snape's innocence, they would have muddled it. Narcissa had once seen Snape's brusque kindness firsthand. She had been present during one of the most consequential scenes in wizarding history, the night she begged for help to protect her son. The memory of those words, "You will look after him?" and the solemn reply, "I will," bound her conscience as tightly as the unbreakable vow bound Snape's life. It was this moment that pushed her to reconsider everything she believed about loyalty. Knowing he had risked everything for Draco, she could not allow Snape's story to be rewritten by those who had never bothered to understand his sacrifices. The Ministry's initial goal was not vindictive, it simply wanted clarity. Kingsley Shacklebolt, now Interim Minister for Magic, aimed to uncover all wartime involvement, including that of the Malfoy family. Yet within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, there were still officials who mistrusted any former Death Eater's testimony. One such official, Aldrich Thornwell, spearheaded investigations into Snape's personal possessions. He believed that Snape's last notebooks retrieved from the Shrieking Shack concealed hidden instructions from Voldemort. Thornwell's ambitions were dangerous because he intended to use his own words to reveal the truth that Potter is too sentimental to admit. When Thornwell sought Draco Malfoy's testimony about Snape's behavior during the final school year, Narcissa realized he was edging closer to discovering the cache of parchments in the manor. She knew these papers detailed Dumbledore's instructions, including the concealed phrase that had appeared once in Snape's notes. Keep the boys safe at all costs. While this would seem noble to any reasonable reader, Thornwell might have twisted it into proof that Snape acted independently of the Order and could have jeopardized wartime intelligence. In that volatile political climate, anything ambiguous could be weaponized. Her decision crystallized during a quiet evening when Draco, pale and exhausted, admitted he feared what would happen if the Ministry found the documents. She walked alone to the manor's eastern drawing room, where the jewelry box lay hidden, and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were 4 folded parchments and a small vial of memories sealed with a wax stamp bearing Snape's initials. The memories, she believed, contained conversations with Dumbledore, possibly even the moment on the astronomy tower. If exposed, these could fuel endless speculation, tearing apart the delicate recognition Harry's testimony had begun to build for Snape. Narcissa realized that some truths, even righteous ones, were too fragile to survive interrogation. She made a calculated choice. 1 parchment she burned, watching the black ink curl into nothing within the violet flames of a non-traceable fire charm. The second she transfigured into a harmless grocery list. The third she simply folded and slipped into the hollow of an old family portrait frame where no aura would think to look. And the vial Snape's memories she entrusted to an unexpected guardian, Andromeda Tonks, her estranged sister. Andromeda had every reason to refuse anything associated with the Malfoys, yet when Narcissa arrived unexpectedly to her home, shaken but resolute, Andromeda understood this was no attempt at manipulation. She took the vial, telling Narcissa only that some wars continue long after the battlefield is gone. The act itself was perilous. If the Ministry discovered she had destroyed evidence, Narcissa could have faced Azkaban. Her husband, Lucius, was already under investigation, and her protection had grown limited. Yet she continued her quiet operation with a conviction that surprised even herself. It was the first time Narcissa chose to act not out of fear or familial expectation, but out of a sense of justice shaped by personal loyalty. Snape had guarded Draco's life, and now she would guard Snape's legacy. In the public eye, Narcissa remained silent. She did not argue with the Ministry. She did not defend Snape openly in the Prophet, but her silence did not mean indifference. Instead, she relied on the power of key testimonies that emerged after the battle. Harry Potter's own words during discussions with the Wizengamot became invaluable. He described Snape as Dumbledore's man through and through, echoing the line once said about himself. He shared Snape's final memory, recounting Lily Potter's significance and Snape's unwavering promise. Many recalled the moment in the book when Dumbledore had said, "After all this time?" And Snape's reply, "Always." Those who heard Harry repeat it felt the weight of the man's loyalty. Yet none of these testimonies alone could rewrite public memory. Without Narcissa's intervention, documents taken out of context could have reopened old doubts. For example, one line in Snape's handwriting, "He trusts me beyond reason," could have been interpreted as arrogance or deceit rather than the painful acknowledgement of a burden he never wanted. Narcissa understood nuance better than investigators searching for certainty. Her quiet mission reached its height when Thornwell unexpectedly returned to the manor for an unscheduled search. This time, however, he found nothing of consequence. The parchments were gone, the memories were safely stored elsewhere, and the ministry soon shifted its focus away from Snape entirely. Official documents eventually labelled him posthumously cleared of charges related to the death of Albus Dumbledore, thanks largely to Harry's intervention, but the absence of contradictory material prevented dissent from spiralling into scandal. Narcissa's actions also subtly altered the perception of the Malfoy family. While Lucius remained a disgraced figure, Narcissa was increasingly regarded as a woman who had made one of the first noble choices of her life during the war. Some recalled that she had lied to Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest when she asked Harry if Draco was alive. The simple line from the book, "Is Draco alive?" revealed her priorities had shifted long before Snape's death. That moment marked the beginning of her transformation, but her protection of Snape's legacy cemented it. Years later, when Hogwarts honoured Snape with a quiet, private portrait in the headmaster's office, Minerva McGonagall allowed only a select few to attend the ceremony. Among them was Draco Malfoy, who stood silently before the canvas with a conflicted mixture of shame and gratitude. Narcissa herself declined the invitation, choosing instead to sit in the manor garden where an old blackthorn tree grew. Perhaps she remembered Snape's sharp manner, his rare flashes of sardonic humour, or simply the fact that he had saved her son when no one else could have. In her own way, she ensured that history would see him not as a traitor, but as a man who carried unbearable burdens. Her decision did not erase the past, nor did it absolve her of previous loyalties, but it carved out a moment of unexpected redemption. By hiding the parchments, protecting the memories, and preventing the ministry from misinterpreting unfinished truths, Narcissa Malfoy performed an act of unusual grace. It was a gesture made not for her own benefit, not to elevate the Malfoy name, but to preserve the honour of a man who lived and died in the shadows. Many in the wizarding world never learned of her role, but those who did understood that even in dark families, a single act of integrity can echo louder than generations of ambition. Through this secret intervention, Narcissa created a quiet bridge between past mistakes and future possibilities. She honoured Snape's sacrifices and allowed others to see the man behind the mask. Though the world would remember him for his stern demeanour, students would walk past his portrait for decades, knowing that beneath the darkness lay a loyalty profound enough to change the course of the war. And thanks to Narcissa's silent bravery, that truth remained intact, untarnished, and finally free. Number 20. Lucius donated a family heirloom to reconcile with the ministry. The Malfoy name has always carried a certain weight in the wizarding world, a mixture of aristocratic refinement and an unmistakable chill of superiority. Yet few moments in their long history have stirred as much whispered discussion as the day Lucius Malfoy surrendered the ancient Armandus wand, one of the oldest heirlooms of his lineage, to the Hogwarts Reconstruction Fund. This gesture, shocking even to the most seasoned observers of wizarding politics, marked a turning point not only for the Malfoy family, but also for the Ministry of Magic, which had been seeking a way to reconcile justice with the fragile peace that followed Voldemort's downfall. In the tense months after the Battle of Hogwarts, the Ministry re-examined every case tied to the Death Eaters. Even those who claimed coercion, like Lucius Malfoy, found themselves facing severe penalties, confiscation of property, long interrogations, and the looming threat of Azkaban hovered heavily above the family. Narcissa Malfoy, who had secretly aided Harry Potter at a decisive moment, hoped this would be taken into account, yet the Ministry remained cautious. It was then, as rumours of an impending arrest began to circulate, that Lucius chose a path utterly uncharacteristic for a man so fiercely attached to the symbols of his prestige. The Armandus wand was not a functioning wand in the modern sense, but a ceremonial sceptre carved in the 9th century by Armandus Malfoy, the founder of the family's British branch. Historians described it as a wand that never cast spells but shaped destinies. It was made of frost-white ashwood and inlaid with powdered moonstone that shimmered faintly under starlight. Lucius had displayed it in a private glass case in Malfoy Manor, refusing even to let Draco touch it as a child. The wand symbolized the family's noble standing, its purity, its ancient claim to influence. For a Malfoy, giving it away was akin to renouncing a birthright. During the hearings, the Ministry's Committee on War Crimes questioned Lucius with unnerving persistence. Every detail of his past loyalties was scrutinized. The family's peacetime alliances proved insufficient. The committee wanted proof of change, not heritage. "Your loyalties have shifted like smoke," one official remarked in the report, "and smoke cannot be trusted unless it clears." What followed surprised even the hard-eyed interrogators. Lucius requested a private meeting with Hermione Granger, at that time serving as a consultant to the committee. He informed her of his intention to donate a historically priceless relic, one whose value could not be reduced to galleons or political gestures. The donation was not simply a transaction, it was a symbolic offering of reconciliation. By surrendering the Armandus wand, Lucius was, in essence, relinquishing the very emblem of the ideology that had shaped him. His house, once filled with symbols of power, would now contribute to rebuilding the school where so many lives had been lost. And Hogwarts itself, though scarred by war, was a place that Harry, Hermione, and Ron had vowed to protect. It was a gesture toward the very institution Voldemort had tried to destroy. Historians were astonished when the wand was unveiled inside the restored North Hall of Hogwarts. A discreet plaque beneath it reads, "Gifted in the spirit of peace." This understated phrase hides the emotional cost behind it. Those close to the family insisted that Lucius rarely spoke of the matter afterwards. Draco, who had been quietly attempting to distance himself from his house's dark legacy, confided to a friend that his father's decision felt like losing a part of our past to save our future. It is important to understand that Lucius was not a character accustomed to sacrifice. His actions throughout the books consistently reveal a man ruled by pride, ambition, and fear. When he appeared at Flourish and Blotts, making cutting remarks about Arthur Weasley, or when he slipped Tom Riddle's diary into Ginny Weasley's cauldron, his choices were always driven by a sense of superiority. Yet even in those moments one can see glimpses of the burdens that shaped him. The line, "You have never known what it means to fear the Dark Lord," gives insight into the terror that manipulated him for years. The wand, according to the surviving family records, was linked to one of the earliest alliances between wizarding clans in medieval Europe. Armandus Malfoy had crafted it as a sign of unity during a time of violent feuds. That same wand, centuries later, would serve a similar purpose, although the irony was not lost on many historians. Lucius, who had once embraced a movement that stoked division, now relied on his ancestors' symbol of peace. The narrative felt almost poetic, the past correcting the present. Narcissa Malfoy's reaction remained private. Yet those close to her recalled a certain relief washing over her features after the donation. She had risked everything inside the Forbidden Forest when she whispered, "Is Draco alive?" and lied to Voldemort, a moment that would later be seen as a quiet turning point in the war. Many believe that her moral courage planted the first seeds of change in the Malfoy household, leading eventually to Lucius's difficult but necessary sacrifice. Even at Hogwarts, students whispered about the donation with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. Some insisted that the Malfoys were merely trying to save themselves, but others, especially those who had witnessed Draco's struggle during the 6th school year, sensed sincerity behind the gesture. The castle itself seemed to accept the relic. The moonstone inlays glowed faintly on nights when the Great Lake reflected a full moon, as if the wand remembered its origins and welcomed its new purpose. Hermione Granger, reviewing the committee's files years later, mentioned that Lucius's act had been one of the few offerings made without hidden clauses, bribes, or manipulations. Coming from someone who had once been targeted by the Malfoys' prejudice, this remark carried great weight. She explained that it was not the value of the object that struck her, but the emotional gravity. He surrendered the symbol of his pride. That is something no legislation can demand. Harry Potter himself, though never close to Lucius, could not deny the significance of the gesture. In one of his reflections written for the Hogwarts Alumni Journal, he noted that not all battles are fought with wands. The reconstruction efforts of Hogwarts depended not only on magic, but on the willingness of former adversaries to recognize the cost of their choices. Even if Harry did not trust Lucius entirely, he acknowledged that the gesture contributed to a fragile but necessary peace. The ministry seized the opportunity to present the donation as a landmark in post-war reconciliation. While public opinion remained divided, many families who had suffered losses found comfort in the idea that even the Malfoys, the embodiment of pure-blood elitism, had been forced to confront their past. The Armandus wand became unexpectedly a symbol of unity, displayed alongside artifacts recovered after the war, including pieces of the destroyed viaduct and a fragment of the shattered glass from the Hogwarts Astronomy Tower. With time, the Malfoys retreated from public life, focusing instead on rebuilding their private world. Draco married Astoria Greengrass, a woman who believed deeply in abandoning the old prejudices. Their home grew quieter, gentler, almost as if the family had finally learned the value of humility. Visitors to Malfoy Manor noted that the display case once holding the Armandus wand now remained empty, preserved intentionally to remind the family of what they had given up and why. The wizarding world often forgets that meaningful change rarely arrives with loud proclamations. Sometimes it is found in the quiet surrender of a cherished relic, a moment when a man renowned for his arrogance finally bows to the consequences of his choices. Lucius Malfoy's decision, though controversial, stands as one of the most compelling examples of reluctant redemption in the post-war era. It demonstrated that pride, even when carved into centuries of tradition, can be reshaped when the survival of family and peace demands it. And so the Armandus wand rests in Hogwarts, glowing faintly under torchlight, a silent witness to history. It no longer belongs to the Malfoys, but to the school that has endured destruction, healing, and renewal. For those who walk past it today, students, teachers, visitors, the relic offers a quiet reminder. Even the darkest stories can contain moments of unexpected grace, and even the proudest hearts can learn to surrender for a greater good. Number 21. Draco personally apologized to Neville Longbottom. The years after the Battle of Hogwarts revealed unexpected truths about many former students, but none surprised the school staff more than the quiet moment when Draco Malfoy approached Neville Longbottom with a sincerity that seemed impossible only a short time earlier. Teachers who stayed at the castle during the Restoration described this scene as brief, unadorned, and profoundly human, a moment in which the past cracked open and two former enemies stood on equal ground. They all remembered the boy Draco had once been, proud, sneering, and so deeply entangled in his family's beliefs that he had mistaken cruelty for strength. Yet that afternoon, when the rubble was still being carried out of the Great Hall, they witnessed a young man searching for redemption. In those school years, Draco had frequently targeted Neville with insults meant to diminish him, believing that fear and humiliation were tools to reinforce his own supposed superiority. His words were sharpened by the privilege of a pure-blood upbringing and the encouragement of those who saw kindness as weakness. Neville, by contrast, spent much of his early Hogwarts life trying to shrink into the background, hoping no one would notice the trembling in his voice or the uncertainty in his hands. A memorable description from Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone captured his fragility. Neville was standing there, clutching Trevor, the toad, looking frightened and rather miserable. Draco had recognized that vulnerability immediately and wielded it like a weapon. By the time the war ended, however, the roles of both young men had transformed. Neville no longer resembled the insecure boy of earlier years. His leadership of Dumbledore's army, his defiance against the Carrows, and his final act of heroism in confronting Voldemort's snake revealed a courage shaped through suffering. He had proven true Albus Dumbledore's quiet observation. It is not the abilities you possess that define you, but the choices you make. Those choices had made Neville one of the school's greatest defenders. Draco, on the other hand, had come face to face with the consequences of the life he had inherited. The Malfoy name, once a badge of honor, became a stain that even he no longer wished to carry. The apology took place in the courtyard near the restored staircase where many students once lingered between classes. The afternoon light was dimming, casting long shadows over the stone floor. Neville had been helping Professor Sprout gather scattered fragments of magical flora displaced during the battle. Draco approached slowly, his steps uncertain, as though each pace required a deliberate act of will. Those who saw him later said that he looked different, not in clothing or stature, but in the strained heaviness of his posture, as if he were walking beneath the weight of old choices. Neville's war-earned confidence gave him an aura that Draco had never confronted before. The same boy he once mocked had become the embodiment of true Gryffindor bravery. Witnesses said that Draco's hands were trembling, not in fear of Neville, but in fear of himself, fear of failing to take responsibility. For the first time, Draco was choosing to step outside the shadow of his family. The symbolism of this encounter was unmistakable. It was not about forgiveness alone, but about the courage to admit that the person he had been was not the person he wished to become. Throughout his time in Hogwarts, Draco had repeatedly taken advantage of Neville's insecurities. He mocked Neville's lack of magical skill, ridiculed his forgetfulness, and delighted in watching him falter. The incident that stood out most vividly was from Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Draco sneered about Neville's parents and their fate at St. Mungo's. Although the books describe Neville's grief with restraint, the line, "Neville's round face went white, then red," hinted at the depth of the wound. Draco's comments then were not merely childish cruelty, they were a reflection of the poisonous ideology he had been taught, one that measured human worth by bloodline and ambition rather than integrity. After Voldemort's defeat, those ideologies shattered. The Malfoy family, once untouchable, found itself isolated, watched, and judged. Narcissa and Lucius struggled to navigate their new reality, but Draco carried an additional burden: the knowledge that his actions at school had contributed to the suffering of others. This realization did not come to him all at once. It grew slowly, nourished by silence, by the absence of the Dark Lord's influence, and by the piercing memory of seeing Neville stand alone on the battlefield. That contrast, Neville rising in courage while Draco stumbled in fear, forced him to confront the hollowness of his former arrogance. In the courtyard, Draco stood with the quiet desperation of someone fighting against years of indoctrination. The teachers who later recounted the scene said that the most striking part was the honesty on Draco's face. This was not a performance, nor a disguised attempt to repair family reputation. Instead, it was an intimate recognition that the cruelty he had once seen as normal had been profoundly wrong. In that moment, his remorse became a kind of confession. It was a step toward rebuilding himself not as a Malfoy heir, but as an independent adult capable of acknowledging failure. Neville listened without interruption. His stillness was not the stillness of shock, but of deep understanding. He had learned through the war that monsters were not always born. They were often shaped. The same Neville who once trembled before Draco now stood unshaken, embodying a grace that came from surviving darkness, with his spirit intact. Although the details of what Draco said were not recorded by any witness, his posture alone told the story. Head slightly bowed, hands clasped, voice low. He carried no wand in sight, symbolizing that this gesture came from a place of humility rather than obligation. The most compelling detail shared by the teachers was how Neville responded after the apology ended. He nodded with a solemn acknowledgement, and though nothing more dramatic occurred, the gesture held the quiet dignity of someone who understood the transformative power of remorse. Neville was not a man who harbored grudges, especially after witnessing the devastation caused by hatred. His ability to accept Draco's change did not erase the past, but it recognized that history does not have to dictate the future. Neville had once learned from Dumbledore that there are all kinds of courage, and in that moment he understood that Draco too was displaying a courage of his own. The scene did not spread through Hogwarts as gossip. Instead, it was spoken of only among professors, often in hushed voices, as though they recognized its fragile significance. They had known both boys as children, one struggling to find self-worth, the other struggling to escape the expectations placed upon him. To see them collide in this new, unexpected way was to witness the first steps of healing after years of division. Draco's apology did not instantly transform him into a hero, nor did it make him a perfect man, but it revealed that change was possible, even for those who had strayed far from the path of kindness. In the months that followed, Draco continued to rebuild his life quietly. He returned to study magical theory and potion refinement, distancing himself from the pure blood supremacist beliefs that had once guided him. He avoided the spotlight, appearing at public events only when necessary. Those who met him during this time, including Hermione Granger and Professor McGonagall, noticed a guarded maturity in him, an awareness of the fragile balance between past mistakes and future intentions. His apology to Neville became the first of many attempts to rectify the harm he had caused. Neville, meanwhile, grew into his role as herbology professor and later head of Gryffindor House. He never publicly recounted the moment with Draco, but the story made its way quietly through those who had witnessed it, becoming a subtle reminder that Hogwarts was not only a place where conflicts erupted, but also a place where wounds could heal. In classrooms filled with young witches and wizards, Neville would occasionally mention the importance of humility and the responsibility to correct one's wrongs, a lesson he had learned firsthand. Years later, as Hogwarts regained its former glory, the story of Draco's apology became an unspoken legend among staff. It was never printed in profit columns or written in official memoirs, yet its impact lingered among those who valued the intricacies of human transformation. Draco's gesture symbolized a profound break from the legacy he had inherited. He had chosen to redefine himself through accountability, not entitlement. Students who entered Hogwarts long after the war never knew how tense the atmosphere between houses had once been. They saw only the grown Neville Longbottom, a respected professor with gentle eyes and steady hands, and Draco Malfoy, a reserved but courteous visitor during school events. The hostility of their youth had dissolved into a distant chapter, replaced by a quiet coexistence built on a single moment of vulnerability. The teachers who witnessed that afternoon often reflected on it when speaking to older students about wrongdoing. They emphasized that true strength lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the courage to confront one's failures. Draco had demonstrated that courage, though imperfectly, and Neville had shown the equal courage of acceptance. Together, without fanfare, they shaped a narrative that challenged the simplistic view of villains and heroes. The story remains powerful not because it was dramatic, but because it was deeply real. Two young men, shaped by opposing sides of a brutal conflict, met again in the fragile peace that followed. One carried regrets, the other carried scars. Yet for a brief moment they stood not as symbols of their houses or families, but as individuals capable of choosing compassion over bitterness. And in that quiet courtyard, between the stones still marked by the war, the first seeds of reconciliation were planted. Number 22. The Malfoys helped heal the wounded after the battle. In the uneasy weeks that followed the Battle of Hogwarts, the castle breathed like a wounded giant. The shattered walls exhaled dust, the corridors echoed with quiet pain, and the makeshift hospital wing overflowed with witches and wizards who had survived only by inches. Amid the chaos, one detail was repeated in hushed tones. Some families who had once stood proud in Voldemort's shadow were now silently trying to atone. And most surprising among them were the Malfoys, who, without ceremony or public recognition, stepped forward to offer healing potions, salves, and ingredients from their private reserves, supplies that could save the severely injured regardless of their blood status. Narcissa Malfoy was the first to cross the broken courtyard, with a box of vials held tightly in her pale hands. Witnesses later recalled how she moved not with the hauteur expected of a pureblood aristocrat, but with a quiet determination, as if convinced that simple action might restore something cracked within her family. She approached Padma Patil, who had been helping medics triage injuries since dawn, and handed her the chest filled with blood-replenishing potion, essence of murtlap, and anti-venom phials that many healers had run out of. No flourish, no words of justification, only the simple gesture of a mother who had seen too much death to allow more of it. Many who worked in the castle refused to believe at first that the Malfoys' contribution was anything more than a political maneuver. Yet the healers from St. Mungo's quickly noticed the rarity and quality of the items delivered. Among them was a precious stock of silverleaf essence, a substance useful in treating curse burns like those suffered by Lee Jordan and Parvati Patil. The ingredient was notoriously difficult to obtain legally during Voldemort's regime, but Lucius Malfoy had once purchased it for his personal apothecary collection. Now the same jars were quietly distributed to the medical teams, their labels carefully preserved to ensure proper dosage. One specific case became the heart of whispered conversations, the recovery of Michael Corner, who had been struck by a recast blasting curse during the battle. His chest injuries were so severe that even Madame Pomfrey doubted he would survive the night. When healers realized that a stabilizing dose of concentrated scalar growth was needed, something the hospital wing lacked, Draco Malfoy retrieved a sealed bottle from the family vault without hesitation. Those who witnessed it remembered the tremor in his hands, not as fear, but as an acknowledgement of responsibility. He stood beside the bed until Michael's breathing softened into something stable, and then slipped away before anyone could thank him. Rumors began to circulate that the Malfoys were attempting to cleanse their name after years of allegiance to Voldemort. However, those who watched their efforts closely saw something deeper than reputation polishing. Narcissa spent long nights helping to prepare restorative drafts, sorting ingredients with the same meticulous precision she once reserved for planning formal dinners. Lucius, worn and ghost-like, delivered crates of bandages, bezoars, and even rare powdered moonstone that helped calm magical nerve trauma. Observers knew that such items had been hoarded for Malfoy pride, not philanthropy, and their release marked a silent confession that their power had protected no one, not even themselves. The debates grew fiercer when word spread that the Malfoys were also offering aid to Muggle-borns. For many, this act clashed violently with the family's previous convictions. Yet the truth was undeniable. One morning, Ernie Macmillan found a neat package left anonymously beside the cot of a gravely injured Muggle-born student named Hannah Fleet. Inside were several doses of invigoration draft, a roll of spelled bandages, and a small handwritten note that read only that the donor hoped it would help her breathe easier. Handwriting analysis done by volunteers later revealed it was Narcissa's. The gesture shocked many, for it contradicted decades of Malfoy prejudice with one quiet, humane act. Interestingly, long after the fighting ended, the castle's stone corridors echoed faint remnants of Voldemort's final fall, and people began sharing stories not just of survival, but of unexpected redemption. A few recalled that in the final book, Harry had insisted that the Malfoys, if nothing else, had saved his life. Indeed, Narcissa's choice in the Forbidden Forest had altered the course of the entire war. Now, her actions after the battle gave new weight to that moment, as though her instinct to protect life had grown stronger after she saw how fragile even the greatest warriors could be. The healers often worked in silence beside the Malfoys, never fully acknowledging their presence, but they could not deny the impact of their contributions. Bits of tragedy softened under the work of their hands. A cursed gash on Kingsley Shacklebolt's arm healed after Lucius delivered a rare counter-hex balm. Cho Chang's lingering phantom pain from a dark curse eased when she received a precisely brewed sleeping tincture supplied by Draco. And Professor Sprout used the donated murtlap and dittany to treat dozens of students who had defended the greenhouses from the acromantulas. What made their involvement even more striking was the way the Malfoys avoided attention. There were no speeches, no attempts to stand beside ministry officials, no petitions for public forgiveness. Lucius carried crates with his head bowed. Draco delivered potions to the makeshift infirmary and vanished with a swift turn of the cloak. Narcissa cleaned cauldrons after healers finished brewing, not caring if soot ruined her embroidered sleeves. Their silence was perhaps the first truthful language they had spoken in years. Not everyone accepted this change. Some survivors insisted that old prejudices could not be washed away by a few weeks of charity. Still, others argued that the transformation began long before the battle ended. In the final confrontation at Malfoy Manor, Harry had seen unmistakable hesitation and quiet fear in Draco's eyes. Later, during the Battle of Hogwarts, Draco's reluctance to identify him in the Room of Requirement had been a flicker of moral awakening. When Harry later said Malfoy was lowering his wand, the line echoed symbolically. The wand lowered then, and again now, through acts of restitution rather than rebellion. Professor McGonagall, though she never publicly commented on the Malfoys' involvement, was seen observing their movements with a measured gaze. Some say she noted their efforts in her private journal. Others claimed that she once quietly instructed a healer to accept Lucius's crates without question, suggesting that rebuilding the wizarding world required mercy as much as justice. Whatever her stance, the Malfoys' presence remained tolerated, if not embraced. Those who worked closest with them observed the emotional change most clearly. Draco moved with a heaviness that belied his age, often lingering near the wounded students from his own year. He once stood for nearly an hour beside the bed of Daphne Greengrass, who had been caught in a collapsing staircase and suffered severe spell shock. He brought her a vial of calming draught his father had brewed years earlier, saying nothing but leaving it within easy reach. Her recovery, slow but certain, was one of many quiet victories credited to the supplies they offered. One healer recounted how Narcissa once stopped to adjust the blanket of a young Hufflepuff boy who had lost his family home during the war. It was a fleeting moment, almost invisible amid the chaos, yet it became one of the most repeated stories among staff. For a woman raised to value bloodline over kindness, the simple gesture defied her former beliefs. It was said that she checked on the boy every morning, slipping him fruit or a bit of honey bread from the kitchens, believing perhaps that nurturing someone vulnerable would help mend the fractures in her own life. Even Lucius, who once held his head as high as any aristocrat, changed in ways few could have predicted. One afternoon he personally delivered a jar of ground phoenix ash, a healing substance more valuable than gold, to help mend the burns of Aura Hestia Jones. The jar had once been the centerpiece of his private collection, displayed proudly in glass. Now he set it on the healer's table without ceremony, and turned away before anyone could look him in the eyes. As more stories accumulated, a new perspective emerged in whispered conversations among staff and students. Perhaps the Malfoys were not seeking exoneration, but attempting to find a place in a world that had evolved beyond the ideologies they once embraced. Their efforts did not erase the past, yet they carved out a small space for the possibility of renewal. Theirs was not a redemption arc with bright banners and triumphant proclamations, but a slow, fragile repair of something deeply broken. In this delicate period of reconstruction, the castle itself seemed to respond. The repaired stones gleamed brighter near the infirmary corridor. The once shattered windows cast gentler light across the beds, and the air felt less heavy as the weeks passed. Some said Hogwarts, being a living entity, sensed the sincerity behind the Malfoys' quiet gestures. Perhaps this was true. For if the castle could tolerate ghosts, it could also tolerate those trying, however clumsily, to rise from the shadows of their mistakes. Number 23. Draco donated Astoria's inheritance to charity. Draco Malfoy's transformation was not a moment of sudden enlightenment, but a long, quiet journey marked by losses, reckonings, and the slow erosion of the pride he had once clung to like armor. After the Battle of Hogwarts, when the dust settled and the dead were counted, Draco realized that the Malfoy name, once a symbol of fear and privilege, now carried the weight of guilt. He spent years attempting to rebuild his identity, distancing himself from the legacy of Voldemort and the oppressive ideologies his parents had once embraced. Yet nothing altered him more profoundly than the death of his wife, Astoria Greengrass, whose gentleness had first shown him that redemption was not a public proclamation, but a private discipline. When she died, leaving behind their son Scorpius, Draco found himself holding a life shaped by shadows but illuminated by the memory of a woman who believed in goodness, even when the world doubted it. Astoria had been fragile from the beginning, burdened by a hereditary curse passed down the Greengrass line, an illness so rare that few healers at St. Mungo's could even name it aloud. Despite this, she lived with a quiet determination, refusing to let the disease dictate her destiny. One of her greatest accomplishments was the establishment of the Astor Foundation, a small but passionate organization dedicated to supporting children with rare magical conditions. She founded it in the 7th year after the war, inspired by a child named Lilia Flint, who suffered from stone vein fever, a condition that slowly petrified the skin. Astoria had visited Lilia during her treatment and later wrote in her private journal that a world that turns its face from a child's suffering is a world not worth inheriting. Those words would one day guide Draco more than she could have predicted. After her passing, many believed Draco would retreat entirely from the public eye, withdrawing into the sanctuary of Malfoy Manor with Scorpius and locking the gates behind him. As a widower, he became quieter, more reserved, and for a while the wizarding press circled like restless crows, speculating whether he would abandon Astoria's charity and redirect the inherited Greengrass fortune to strengthen the Malfoy estate. Some critics within the Wizengamot whispered that a Malfoy would never let gold leave the family vaults voluntarily. Others insisted he had only changed on the surface, and that old instincts lie dormant but never die. Draco heard all of it, but he let the noise fade into the background, for grief had given him a new kind of clarity. 6 months after Astoria's funeral, Draco returned to the dilapidated brick building in Diagon Alley that served as the headquarters of the Astor Foundation. The sight of Astoria's handwriting on the fundraising posters nearly broke him. But he walked into her office, a small room filled with dried lavender and stacks of parchment, and sat at her desk for the first time. It was there, surrounded by her unfinished projects, that he noticed a folder labeled "Future Plans for When I Get Better." Inside were proposals she had drafted to expand the foundation, a medical scholarship for young healers, donations to St. Mungo's Experimental Remedies Department, and a camp for children afflicted with chronic magical diseases. Draco read every word and felt something within him shift, an ache that was equal parts sorrow and purpose. When Draco visited Gringotts to settle Astoria's estate, he shocked even the goblins. Instead of claiming full control of the Greengrass assets reserved for her, he instructed that a substantial portion, 35%, totaling just under 450,000 galleons, be legally transferred to the Astor Foundation. He did this quietly, without public announcement, and asked Griphook's successor, a stern goblin named Ragnok, to process the transaction with no special notice. But acts of generosity rarely stay hidden for long, especially when they involve a family with a history as notorious as the Malfoys. Within a week, copies of the sealed financial records appeared in the Daily Prophet, accompanied by articles that struggled to reconcile the cold boy from Hogwarts with the man who had given away nearly half a fortune. Some journalists attempted to cast suspicion on his motives but those familiar with the foundation knew the truth. He had done it because Astoria had believed in those children. The same week that the donation was finalized, Draco visited St. Mungo's to check on Lilia Flint, now a teenager recovering from her latest treatment. Seeing her smile at him with unguarded gratitude, he felt a rare moment of peace. He remembered how Astoria had quoted Dumbledore once, saying, "It is our choices, Draco, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." These words, originally spoken to Harry Potter, had found their way into Draco's conscience, like a quiet echo from the past. Draco began taking an active role in the Foundation's work. He attended board meetings, reviewed treatment proposals, and even made personal visits to families struggling with magical illnesses. One such family, the Digby Carrows, had twin sons born with dragon scale atrophy, a condition causing their skin to flake with ember-like burns. When Draco arrived at their cottage with a grant approval letter, the parents stood speechless. They had once feared the Malfoy name, but now they saw a man softened by loss yet strengthened by purpose. Draco later confided in an old Hogwarts acquaintance that helping them had felt like breathing clean air for the first time in years. Through these actions, the public slowly began to see Draco not as the pale, sneering Slytherin boy who once mocked Hermione Granger and idolized pureblood supremacy, but as a man who had lived through the consequences of hatred and emerged humbled. Astoria had once told him that kindness was not loud, it was steady, like rainstorms wearing down stone. Draco understood this differently now. He realized that by honoring her legacy, he was also healing the deepest fractures within himself. Fractures carved by fear, manipulation, and a childhood spent chasing approval in all the wrong places. Scorpius, although very young when Astoria died, grew up surrounded by reminders of her work. Draco often brought him to Foundation events, letting him place enchanted lilies on fundraising tables or hold the charmed lanterns that glowed with silver light. As Scorpius grew older, Draco made a point of telling him why they were there, not to parade their wealth or lineage, but to continue what Astoria had begun. He wanted his son to know that compassion was not weakness, but strength. When Scorpius later entered Hogwarts and became close friends with Albus Potter, Draco felt a strange sense of poetic symmetry, as if the past were finally releasing its grip. The Malfoy estate itself changed under Draco's stewardship. Portraits of dark-robed ancestors were moved from prominent halls to quieter storage rooms. The Manor Library expanded its selection of medical books, charitable records, and peacetime histories. Astoria's favourite greenhouse, once wilting, was restored to bloom year-round, filled with healing herbs she had cultivated for potions research. Draco tended it himself on many evenings, wearing work robes instead of the immaculate garments his father once demanded. The act of caring for Astoria's plants, many of them rare and temperamental, became a ritual of remembrance. There were still whispers, of course. Certain old pure-blood families muttered that Draco had dishonoured his lineage by squandering the Greengrass inheritance. But these criticisms no longer held power over him. He had lived long enough under the weight of expectations that had brought nothing but shame. Now he lived under a different measure, Astoria's unwavering belief that even deeply flawed people could choose goodness. When he felt doubt creep in, he reread a note she had left tucked inside her potions journal. In her delicate handwriting she had written, "When in doubt, choose the path that brings light to someone else." One particularly significant moment occurred 2 years after the donation, when the Astor Foundation funded a breakthrough treatment for a condition known as star lung syndrome. A young wizard named Aidan Montmorency, previously given only months to live, responded miraculously to the new therapy. His mother sent Draco a letter describing how her son had told her, "I feel like I'm finally breathing sunlight." Draco kept that letter in his study drawer, folded and refolded until the edges softened, a testament to the power of choices made in grief. Harry Potter himself eventually learned of Draco's charitable actions through Hermione, who had quietly assisted the Astor Foundation with legal protections. Harry reportedly said that Draco's deed proved more than any apology ever could. It was a subtle acknowledgement, echoing the transformation already evident to those closest to Draco. The boy who once proclaimed that some families are better than others had become a man defined not by privilege, but by kindness. In many ways, Draco's donation was not the end of Astoria's legacy, but the beginning of its flourishing. The foundation grew from a modest operation into one of the most respected magical medical charities in Britain. It established partnerships with St. Mungo's, sponsored research symposiums, and even inspired similar foundations abroad. Astoria's vision had been to create a world where no child suffered alone, and Draco's grief-born generosity transformed that vision into enduring reality. Over time, even those skeptical of his transformation had to admit that Draco Malfoy had changed. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, now softened when speaking of Astoria's work. His posture, once rigid with superiority, now carried the humility of a man who had known profound loss and found redemption in devotion to something greater than himself. Redemption, after all, is not a grand declaration, but a pattern of small, steadfast choices. Draco made those choices daily. He continued to live quietly, away from headlines, but the impact of his actions resonated throughout the wizarding world. Children who had once faced early graves now grew into adulthood. Families who had nearly lost hope found themselves supported by a man they never expected to rely on. The Malfoy name, long associated with darkness, began to take on a new meaning, one shaped by healing, compassion, and remembrance. Years later, visitors to the Astor Foundation would pass a small silver plaque near the entrance. It bore Astoria's name, followed by a simple inscription chosen by Draco himself: "Where love endures, darkness fails." And though Draco never sought recognition, those familiar with the story understood that this plaque spoke as much about him as it did about Astoria. For by giving away part of a fortune once tainted by the ideals of supremacy and fear, Draco Malfoy had restored something infinitely more valuable, the integrity of a heart transformed by loss, love, and the courage to do good even when no one expected it of him. Number 24. Narcissa refused to report on former classmates. Harry Potter's world remembers the Malfoy name with a mixture of dread and fascination, yet there exists a moment after the fall of Voldemort when the family, long associated with pride, elitism, and a dangerous loyalty to purity ideology, revealed an unexpected moral depth. When the Ministry of Magic began its vast investigation into former Death Eaters and their allies, many assumed Narcissa Malfoy would be among the first to betray every acquaintance she ever had in order to protect her family. But what followed became one of the most overlooked acts of quiet courage in the post-war era. In the weeks after Voldemort's defeat, the Ministry brought Narcissa in for repeated questioning. The newly restored order was still fragile, shaken by the horror of the Battle of Hogwarts. Everyone sought justice, but few had the patience for nuance. The Ministry demanded names, lists, accusations, anything that could help them root out remaining collaborators. Yet Narcissa entered each interrogation with a calm dignity that unsettled even the most seasoned aurors. Although she admitted her allegiance to Voldemort's circle, she refused to condemn those whose guilt rested only on fear or coercion. She knew what the Ministry wanted. They hoped she would mention Pansy Parkinson, who once tried to hand Harry over to Voldemort out of sheer terror. They expected her to name Blaise Zabini, whose aloof nature had always made him suspect. They pushed her to accuse former house elves, shop owners, and minor pureblood families who had kept their heads down rather than oppose the Dark Lord. Under pressure, most would have saved themselves by offering any name that would satisfy their interrogators. But Narcissa did not bend. What made her defiance striking was that she herself had every incentive to capitulate. Her husband, Lucius Malfoy, was facing serious charges. Her son, Draco, was still under scrutiny, despite Harry's testimony that he had hesitated at crucial moments. The Malfoy name was tattered, their influence gone, their safety uncertain. One endorsement from Narcissa, one convenient accusation, could have softened the Ministry's stance toward her family. Yet she did what no one expected from a woman raised to protect her own above all else. She refused to trade someone else's life for her family's comfort. She remembered all too clearly how Voldemort's regime operated. Fear had been its primary weapon, not spells or monsters. During one of her interrogations, Narcissa reportedly said to an aura that she had witnessed too many lives destroyed by people desperate to save themselves. Her refusal to continue that cycle echoed the moment in the Forbidden Forest when she looked into Harry's eyes and lied to the Dark Lord himself, an act rooted not in ideology but in a mother's capacity for moral clarity. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, her voice trembles as she asks Harry, "Is Draco alive?" The answer shapes her fate, and in that moment she chooses truth, love, and protection over fear. The Ministry interrogators, however, could not accept her silence. They demanded she give testimony implicating Theodore Nott, whose father was a known Death Eater, yet whose own involvement was minimal and mostly forced. They urged her to confirm suspicions about Daphne Greengrass, who had quietly avoided involvement in any dark activities. They even asked her to recall conversations from dinner parties long past, hoping she would twist innocent remarks into incriminating evidence. But Narcissa would not let desperation turn her into an agent of another witch hunt. Her stance became even more admirable when she defended several families who had previously viewed the Malfoys with suspicion. She spoke of the Bulstrodes, who were rumoured to have given supplies to the Death Eaters, but who, in truth, had been forced to hand over food at one point. She mentioned the Montagues, whose son had once been injured in a cruel prank by Fred and George Weasley, yet who had never shown allegiance to Voldemort. This unexpected honesty left the interrogators frustrated. She offered nothing that fit their expectations and everything that demanded moral consideration. One particularly emotional moment came when the Ministry tried to force her to implicate Andromeda Tonks, her estranged sister. Many believed the Malfoys held resentment toward Andromeda for marrying Muggle-born Ted Tonks. The Ministry hoped to exploit the family fracture, suggesting that Andromeda might have secretly communicated with dark sympathizers during the war. But Narcissa's answer was firm. She insisted that Andromeda had remained loyal to the Order and that she herself would never stain her sister's name for political convenience. It was the closest she came to raising her voice during any interrogation. Her behavior contrasted sharply with the image the wizarding world had built around her. Most remembered her as the elegant, cold wife of a powerful man, someone who had benefited from the old, dark order. Yet in those post-war days, she carried herself not with pride, but with a kind of weary compassion. Having spent years under Voldemort's tyranny, watching her home be invaded, and witnessing her son nearly lose his life, she understood the human cost of blind allegiance better than most. She had seen how cruelty thrives when people betray each other out of fear. The irony is that Narcissa's refusal to accuse others mirrored the central theme of Harry's story, that survival means nothing if it requires the destruction of one's humanity. Her actions reflected the sentiment Dumbledore once expressed. "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." Though Narcissa had chosen poorly in the past, her choices after the war revealed a woman grasping for redemption not through speeches or public displays, but through quiet, steadfast integrity. The people she refused to condemn would later speak of her with a complicated gratitude. Blaise Zabini reportedly called her a woman who finally understood what fear can do to a person. Daphne Greengrass told friends that Narcissa's silence had saved her family from years of wrongful suspicion. Even Madame Malkin, who had been threatened during the height of Voldemort's rule, acknowledged that Narcissa had once discreetly paid for repairs to her shop after a group of Death Eaters trashed it. For years, such acts went unnoticed, overshadowed by the Malfoy family's darker reputation. As the Ministry continued its investigation, Narcissa's unwavering principles began to reshape her public image. Some Aurors privately admitted that she was one of the few former associates of Voldemort who did not appear driven by self-interest. Others argued that she was merely protecting her social circle. Yet the evidence contradicted that assumption. She had refused to shield even those who had willingly supported Voldemort, including several pure-blood families she had socialized with for decades. If their guilt was clear, she did not intervene. It was only the innocent or the frightened she defended. Her conduct eventually played a crucial role in Draco's own redemption. The Ministry took note of her honesty and restraint, and Harry himself, still haunted by the memory of Narcissa saving his life in the forest, spoke in quiet support of the family during a private meeting with Kingsley Shacklebolt. Harry later reflected that although he would never fully trust the Malfoys, he could recognize courage when he saw it. In the book, a simple line reminds readers of the complexity of their character. The Malfoys, Draco with his mother on one side, his father on the other, stood apart as though unsure whether or not they belonged there. That uncertainty was the beginning of transformation. Over time, Narcissa's silent refusal became a story passed in whispers across the wizarding world. It symbolized the small, unseen acts of decency that often shape history more profoundly than grand gestures. She had lived through a regime that demanded absolute obedience and encouraged betrayal. To participate in another cycle of persecution, even under the banner of justice, would have meant becoming the very thing she despised. Her resistance, subtle as it was, signaled the first meaningful break between the Malfoys and the ideology that had defined them for generations. Many years later, as the wizarding world healed, scholars and journalists reassessed the role of the Malfoy family. Most still acknowledged their complicity in Voldemort's rise, but they also noted Narcissa's unique moral stance. She did not pretend to be a hero. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply acted according to a truth she had learned too late, but embraced wholeheartedly, that justice cannot be built on fear. When historians speak of noble acts following the Battle of Hogwarts, they often focus on Harry's bravery, Neville's stand, or McGonagall's leadership. But buried within the quieter pages of that chaotic period lies the story of a woman who held her ground when it would have been easiest to surrender to panic. Narcissa Malfoy's refusal to denounce her former classmates and acquaintances did not erase her past, but it illuminated her character in a way no one expected. Her act was not grand enough to be carved onto monuments, but it was noble in the way that truly matters. It stopped a new era of fear from blossoming under a different banner. It reminded the ministry that justice must not be twisted into vengeance, and it taught her son a final, invaluable lesson, one that shaped the rest of his life, that redemption is found not in speeches, but in the quiet bravery of doing what is right when the world expects you to do wrong. Number 25. Lucius helped capture remaining Death Eaters. Lucius Malfoy's return to public life after the Second Wizarding War was neither triumphant nor warmly embraced. His reputation lay in ruins, overshadowed by years of allegiance to Voldemort and the stain of supporting the darkest forces Britain had ever known. Yet in these years of quiet reconstruction, after the smoke of the Battle of Hogwarts had barely settled, Lucius made a decision few anticipated. He offered to help the ministry locate the last surviving Death Eaters who had scattered across the wizarding world, vanishing into forests, safe houses, and the labyrinthine networks they once believed impenetrable. It was a choice that stunned even those accustomed to Malfoy's talent for self-preservation, for this time the stakes involved not his own safety, but the security of the entire magical community. For weeks, Lucius faced the cold stone walls of interrogation rooms, sharing details he had once vowed never to reveal. Although he had not fought in the final battle, his fear and desperation had left him paralyzed. He still possessed knowledge of meeting places, coded phrases, and escape routes used by those who had long served the Dark Lord. Many officials doubted him, yet no one could deny the accuracy of his recollections. He named individuals such as Thorfinn Rawle, Walden McNair, and Selwyn, explaining where they had fled in the aftermath of Voldemort's downfall. He described manor basements converted into ritual chambers, abandoned hunting lodges once used as temporary headquarters, and even the enchanted tunnel beneath Nocturne Alley through which several Death Eaters had escaped. This was not the vague regret of a man trying to soften his sentence. It was precise, actionable intelligence. The ministry, still shaken and understaffed, began following his information with great reluctance. They expected dead ends, traps, or misdirection, but Lucius's testimony led them to their first major success, the capture of Washi Rual, near an old hideout in the Forest of Dean. When approached by Aurors, Rawle had attempted to hex his way out with a fury that demonstrated just how dangerous he remained. Yet the Aurors had been ready for him, thanks to a description Lucius provided of Rawle's tendency to cast a blasting curse first, before anything else. In the report filed afterward, one young Auror wrote that Malfoy's notes prevented casualties that we would almost certainly have suffered. The capture sent a shockwave through the underground cells of surviving Death Eaters, shaking their confidence and forcing them to reconsider their hiding places. Lucius observed the unfolding arrests from the isolation of his home at Malfoy Manor, a place that had once been synonymous with power and fear. He had become a man stripped of influence, walking through halls haunted by the echoes of his own misjudgments. Even Draco, who had suffered enough through the war, watched his father with a complicated mixture of pride and confusion. It was in this melancholic environment that Lucius confronted an uncomfortable truth. He had been complicit in a system of violence, and the only way to even begin to make amends was to dismantle the remnants of that system, one name, one location, one remembered detail at a time. Among the most remarkable instances of Lucius' cooperation involved Walden McNair, the executioner once aligned with the ministry itself. McNair was notorious not only for his cruelty, but for his uncanny talent for disappearing when cornered. Lucius recalled a hidden stable house near Inverness that Voldemort had once designated as a northern escape corridor. It had been years since Lucius had been there, but the smell of cold stone and wet hay lingered vividly in his mind. Ministry officials travelled to the area expecting disappointment, only to find traces of magical activity, protective enchantments carved into the wood, remnants of recent spells cast, and a concealed trapdoor leading to a room enchanted with soundproof barriers. McNair was recovered 2 days later, less than a mile away. The ministry acknowledged that the breakthrough came directly from Lucius's recollection, an admission they released quietly, almost reluctantly. Even more telling were Lucius' insights into Death Eater communication codes. Voldemort's inner circle had used a series of tokens, small, charmed objects that would glow or shift color, depending on summoned orders. Lucius still possessed one of these coins, tucked away in a drawer he had not opened since the days of the Dark Lord's rule. Its magic had long faded, but its inscriptions remained, and they helped the ministry decipher how messages had been routed. This led investigators to discover a safe house network hidden beneath Manchester's abandoned textile district, where 2 fugitives, Selwyn and Travers, had been coordinating shipments of cursed artifacts. The Aurors who raided the hideout reported that the fugitives were preparing to flee the country and would have done so within hours. Throughout this period, Lucius was haunted by memories of his own downfall. He remembered the moment in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets when Dobby warned him, "You shall not harm Harry Potter." He remembered how easily cruelty had once come to him, how seamlessly he had aligned himself with a cause he believed would protect his status. He recalled Voldemort's humiliating confiscation of his wand, a symbol of how little loyalty had mattered to the Dark Lord in the end. These memories, once sources of pride or terror, had begun to transform into reminders of the price of blind allegiance. His decision to help the ministry was not the impulsive act of a frightened man. It was a deliberate, painful recognition that the future depended on eliminating the ideology he had once embraced. When he watched Narcissa moving quietly through their home, trying to restore some semblance of dignity to their lives, Lucius felt the weight of every choice he had made. Her bravery during the battle, lying to Voldemort to save their son, was a mirror of the courage he knew he now had to show in a different way. The Malfoy family had survived because one of them had chosen love over fear. Lucius understood that it was now his turn. The ministry's relationship with him remained cold, but certain individuals, including Kingsley Shacklebolt, acknowledged privately that Lucius' contributions had prevented a resurgence of Death Eater activity. Kingsley reportedly remarked that a man stepping away from darkness should not be ignored when he shows the courage to do so. Those words were never spoken publicly, yet within the Aura office they carried great weight. For the first time, Lucius felt the faintest hint of institutional forgiveness, not acceptance, not absolution, but recognition. One of the most powerful examples of Lucius's shift came when he provided information about a ritual circle hidden in a coastal cave south of Dover. It had been a meeting place for several of Voldemort's most radical followers, including Antonin Dolohov, before Dolohov's capture. Lucius revealed the existence of a cache of cursed potions stored there, including one capable of causing magical hallucinations. The ministry recovered the potions before they could be used by the remaining fugitives. The recovery earned Lucius no praise, but it prevented a potential tragedy and solidified his role in protecting the fragile post-war peace. Throughout these efforts, Lucius remained painfully aware that many in the wizarding community would never trust him again. He accepted this as part of his penance. Public opinion was shaped by years of fear, and by the image of him standing proudly beside Voldemort in the Department of Mysteries. Yet even as the prophet reported each new Death Eater arrest, there were rumors whispered in the corridors of the Ministry. Malfoy helped, some said. He knows more than he lets on, said others. The whispers were few, but they mattered. Lucius kept no journal of these months, but those who saw him described a man aged beyond his years, walking carefully as though every memory might cut him. His silver cane, once a symbol of haughty superiority, had become a quiet companion, something to lean on when the burden of his choices pressed too heavily. He never spoke of redemption, for he knew redemption was not his to claim. What he sought was responsibility, a word that had once meant little to him, but now guided every decision he made. It was Harry Potter himself who once observed, in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, that we're all human, aren't we? Every human life is worth the same, and worth saving. Although Lucius never heard these words directly, their truth echoed in the aftermath of war. Perhaps he had failed to understand this during Voldemort's rise, but in the ruins of his old life he slowly came to embody it. He could not reclaim the past, but he could safeguard the future. The capture of the last fugitive linked to his information marked the end of Lucius's cooperation, yet not the end of his quiet commitment to rebuilding what had been broken. He retreated into the private world of his family, choosing a life of reflection rather than ambition. He raised Draco's son Scorpius with a gentleness that even Narcissa had not expected, determined that the next generation of Malfoys would never know the seduction of darkness. In the end, Lucius's noble act was not defined by the Ministry's files or the arrests he facilitated. It was defined by the moment he realized that true loyalty, the kind he had never offered Voldemort, belonged to the world his family lived in, the world he had once endangered. It was defined by the courage to betray those who had stood beside him, because the cause they served had been built on cruelty and deception. And it was defined by understanding that even a man who had walked deep into shadow could still guide others safely out of it. Number 26. Draco became a mentor for bullied students. Draco Malfoy had spent most of his youth in Hogwarts, cultivating a reputation built on arrogance, elitism, and cruelty. Yet when his son Scorpius arrived at the castle, Draco found himself forced to confront the shadows of his own past. He walked through the same corridors with the eyes of a father, not a swaggering Slytherin boy, and what he saw unsettled him. The laughter that echoed in the hallways sometimes carried an edge he recognized too well. It reminded him of the way he once mocked Hermione Granger for her heritage, or jeered at Ron Weasley for his poverty. What had once felt like power now looked terrifyingly like harm. And for the first time in decades, Draco wondered what his old actions had done to others, and what similar wounds might now be inflicted on children like his son. The realization struck Draco with surprising force during Scorpius's first winter at Hogwarts. He received a letter, the handwriting shaky and rushed, explaining that other students whispered about the cursed child and avoided sitting near him. Draco felt a familiar bitterness rise, the same bitterness he had felt whenever the name Malfoy was condemned in the wake of the war. But this time the anger was not directed outward. It wrapped itself around his heart, reminding him of every moment he had been the one spreading fear instead of comfort. He had once believed Hogwarts would become gentler after Voldemort's fall. Instead, it still harbored pockets of cruelty, carried out not by dark wizards, but by frightened children. Draco reached out to Professor McGonagall, who welcomed any initiative to support struggling students. Though hesitant at first, old reputations died hard. The staff saw in Draco a father determined to change what had once defined him. The younger teachers, such as Neville Longbottom, offered cautious encouragement. Draco could not help noticing the irony. Neville, whom he had bullied relentlessly, now stood across from him, offering trust without demanding repayment. It was a small sign that redemption was not only possible, but already unfolding. Draco's first attempt at helping a student came almost by accident. He encountered a first-year Hufflepuff named Miriam Fletchley, who stood frozen outside the Great Hall, refusing to enter because a group of Ravenclaw boys had laughed at her stutter. Draco paused, looking at the girl's trembling hands, and for a moment he saw the frightened faces he had once intimidated. Miriam reminded him painfully of Luna Lovegood, whom he and others had mocked mercilessly. The memory of Luna sitting alone with her radish earrings heavy in the candlelight clung to him. He knelt beside Miriam and shared something he had never admitted publicly: that cruelty, once unleashed, follows a person long after the laughter ends. In these moments, Draco found himself echoing words Harry Potter had once spoken after the Battle of Hogwarts. It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. Draco had formerly scoffed at such phrases, believing lineage mattered more than moral courage. But as he repeated the words aloud to Miriam, he realized they were no longer Potter's words in his mind. They had become his own compass, guiding him toward a version of himself he had not known he could become. As more students heard rumors of Malfoy secretly helping younger children, they began approaching him voluntarily. A Gryffindor second year named Rowan McKinnon sought him out after being cornered by older Slytherins for refusing to hand over her enchanted quill. Draco listened without judgment, surprising even himself. He offered Rowan practical advice: where to walk at night, how to discreetly contact a prefect, and how to report harassment without fear of retaliation. But beyond the logistics, he offered something far more valuable: the reassurance that the opinions of bullies never define the worth of the bullied. Draco's role gradually evolved from occasional helper to what students began calling their silent guardian. He avoided public displays. Hogwarts was not ready for a grand announcement about Draco Malfoy mentoring vulnerable students, and neither was he. Yet he became a steady presence. He sat quietly near the library entrance in the evenings, appearing to read but always alert. He memorized names, he studied patterns. He learned painfully how often kindness went unspoken because children feared appearing weak. Each whispered confession forced Draco to confront new layers of regret for the years he had spent as the source of similar anguish. One night, when the wind howled through the high windows of the astronomy tower, Draco met with a group of older students who wanted guidance. Among them was Tobias Kirker, a Slytherin whose sharp tongue had already earned him notoriety. Tobias confessed that he lashed out because he felt overshadowed by his accomplished older brothers. Draco recognized his former self in the boy: the restless need to prove superiority, the fear of insignificance. Draco answered not with reprimands, but with hard-earned honesty, explaining that masking insecurity with cruelty leads only to a legacy of shame. Tobias listened, and for the first time since he had arrived at Hogwarts, his posture softened. Draco began to keep a small journal, enchanted, so that only he could read its contents. In it, he wrote about each student he assisted, reflecting on his own failures and triumphs. He noted how Miriam Fletchley smiled more often now, and how Rowan Mackinnon had become a fierce defender of younger Gryffindors. He recorded the struggles of Tobias Kirk and of a shy Ravenclaw girl named Selena Hawthorne, who feared losing her place on the Quidditch team because of relentless teasing. Draco's journal became his quiet testament to growth, not just the students, but his own. He often sat with Scorpius in the Malfoy garden during holidays, sharing just enough of his experiences without revealing the confidences of the children he helped. Scorpius once confessed feeling overwhelmed by the pressure of the Malfoy name, unsure whether he could ever escape the shadow of his family's past. Draco reassured him that the Malfoy legacy was not unchangeable. He explained that redemption is not an event, but a series of choices made again and again until the world begins to see a different reflection. Scorpius listened closely, the lantern light flickering across his thoughtful expression, and for Draco, that single moment felt like a completed circle. The past acknowledged, the future redirected. Draco found that offering guidance healed pieces of himself he had not known were still fractured. He remembered the look on Dumbledore's face during their final conversation atop the astronomy tower. A look filled with disappointment, yes, but also a glimmer of faith that Draco could choose another path. Dumbledore had once said, "It is the unknown we fear when we look upon death and darkness, nothing more." Draco discovered that confronting the darkness within himself was far more terrifying than facing Voldemort's cruelty. Yet step by step, he made peace with his past, transforming it from a burden into a lesson he could use to protect others. There were moments when Draco's old instincts resurfaced. He sometimes felt the urge to snap at a student whose arrogance reminded him of himself at 15, but instead of reacting harshly, he paused and breathed, remembering that he was no longer the boy who laughed when others cried. He was a man rebuilding the Malfoy name not through power or wealth, but through compassion. Each time he resisted falling back into old patterns, he gained a little more control over the echoes of his former self. Draco's transformation did not go unnoticed among the faculty. Professor Sprout, who had once scolded him for mocking students in herbology, observed him patiently helping Selena Hawthorne repot a stubborn mandrake during an open workshop. She later remarked to McGonagall that Draco had become someone the younger children trust in ways that feel unexpected, yet deeply right. Hearing this, Draco felt an emotion unfamiliar from his school days, pride not rooted in superiority but in sincerity. Perhaps the most profound shift occurred when Draco encountered a letter slipped anonymously under his door. It was from a former student he had mentored, thanking him for being the first adult who made me feel seen. The letter continued, explaining that his guidance had given the young witch courage to stand up for herself when confronted by classmates who mocked her accent. Draco read the note several times, each word striking him with the realization that he had done something no charm or potion could replicate. He had given hope. The transformation of Draco Malfoy into a mentor was not a dramatic spectacle, nor a redemption arc praised in The Daily Prophet. It was slow, almost invisible, built from countless small moments where he chose kindness over indifference. Yet these small moments formed something extraordinary, a new legacy. The old whispers about the Malfoys faded, replaced by quieter ones, spoken with respect rather than fear. Draco had once believed his family name was irreparably stained, but now students spoke of him as someone who had turned his darkest experiences into light for others. Draco understood that he could never undo the pain he caused in his youth, but he could shape the future in ways that made that pain meaningful. By guiding children away from cruelty, he ensured that none would repeat the mistakes he had once made. And in doing so, he carved a new chapter in the story of the Malfoys, one not defined by shadows, but by the noble act of protecting those who needed it most. Number 27. The Malfoys funded the restoration of the Hogwarts Library. The decision of the Malfoy family to finance the restoration of the Hogwarts Library after the Second Wizarding War surprised the entire magical world. Only months earlier, their name had been associated not with philanthropy, but with fear, old prejudices, and a heritage built on blood purity. Yet as the dust of battle settled and broken shelves, burned manuscripts and shattered windows revealed the extent of the school's wounds, Narcissa Malfoy approached Headmistress Minerva McGonagall with an offer nobody expected. She wished to rebuild what had been lost, but not merely to return it to its former state. She insisted on funding a new wing dedicated to knowledge the Malfoys had once refused to acknowledge, books on Muggle history, Muggle-born contributions to magic, and studies of prejudice itself. Many at Hogwarts remembered how Lucius Malfoy had once boasted that some families are better off without certain bloodlines, a sentiment reflected in the Dark Era when the Ministry, under Voldemort's control, conducted purges against Muggle-born witches and wizards. When word spread that it was this same household proposing the creation of a wing titled the Hall of Shared Heritage, students whispered in corridors, unable to decide whether the gesture was guilt, strategy, or genuine transformation. Hermione Granger, who returned to Hogwarts briefly to help assess damaged sections of the library, reportedly said to McGonagall, "If this truly comes from them, then Hogwarts is witnessing a rare moment of change." Her presence added weight to the reconstruction, especially as she had once fought relentlessly against the ideology the Malfoys defended. The most striking example of their shift occurred when Draco Malfoy personally selected a set of texts written by Muggle-born researcher Calliope Harland, whose work focused on magical resilience among children raised in non-magical environments. His signature appeared at the bottom of the funding request that acquired the complete Harland collection. This was especially symbolic, given that years earlier Draco had mocked Hermione for her parentage, repeating his family's ideology at every opportunity. Now his decision ensured that Harland's research would be available to generations of students. The contrast between his past and his new actions echoed a familiar line from Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. "It is the unknown we fear, nothing more." Draco seemed determined to replace that fear with understanding. Narcissa Malfoy's motivations, though never publicly stated, were quietly discussed among Hogwarts staff. After all, she had played a pivotal role during the war when she saved Harry's life by whispering to Voldemort that the boy was dead. In that moment, she had chosen compassion over loyalty, her son's safety over ideology. It was consistent then that Narcissa, more than Lucius, pressed for the library's reconstruction to focus on unity. She selected books detailing Muggle cultural achievements, even insisting on a shelf devoted solely to Muggle art. Her choices hinted that she now understood the power of knowledge to break the chains of inherited prejudice. "If we do not recognize the dignity of others," Dumbledore once told Harry, "we lose our own." Though Dumbledore was gone, it was as though Narcissa finally embraced that truth. Lucius Malfoy, still haunted by the war and marked by disgrace, contributed in silence. He signed all necessary documents and released the family vault's funds, but rarely attended meetings. Yet one act revealed the depth of his internal conflict. He donated a rare, centuries-old volume titled The Lexicon of Ancient Magical Cultures, a book that had been in the Malfoy family for generations, and seldom seen by outsiders, by choosing to give away a piece of his lineage. Lucius made a symbolic acknowledgement that knowledge must not be hoarded by a select few. Many considered it a quiet apology, not through words but through relinquishing something historically tied to his family's elitism. The rebuilding process exposed hidden corners of the old library, including a chamber untouched since the days of headmaster Phineas Nigellus Black. Here, McGonagall found fragments of damaged manuscripts documenting early objections to Muggle oppression within the wizarding world. When she presented these to the contributors, Draco insisted they be preserved and displayed in the new wing. This decision proved crucial, as the display countered the myth, one long promoted by pure-blood supremacists, that anti-Muggle sentiment had always been the natural order. Draco's insistence signaled that he wanted history recorded honestly, even when inconvenient for families like his own. Harry Potter himself, though not directly involved in the restoration, visited during the early stages. He walked through the rubble where the room of hidden things had collapsed into the grounds and through the charred remains of shelves once filled with enchanted tomes. Witnessing the transformation funded by the Malfoys left him reflective. According to several staff members, Harry remarked quietly that the school had seen too much pain and needed gestures like this. His words echoed Dumbledore's teaching from Order of the Phoenix. Understanding is the first step to acceptance, and only with acceptance can there be recovery. It seemed fitting that even in peace, Harry recognized how symbolic this restoration was. One of the new wing's most discussed sections became the Muggle-born Innovators' Hall, featuring portraits and biographies of witches and wizards who reshaped magical society despite humble origins. The Malfoys funded the enchantments that animated these displays. Among them was a moving portrait of Helene Hawthorne, a healer whose groundbreaking charm saved thousands during the Dragonpox outbreak of 1882. When Draco reviewed the final selection, he insisted on including a small plaque acknowledging that Hawthorne's contributions were ignored by pureblood historians for more than a century. This willingness to correct historical erasure demonstrated an emerging integrity he had never shown at school.